During World War II, there were many men and women who became notorious for their crimes and actions inside of prisons or concentration camps. At the end of the conflict, some of these were brought to trial for their crimes, and they were then sent crashing through the gallows, or they were shot. But these guards became known for their terror and torture, and prisoners did not even want to look at them in the eye, as they were worried as to what would happen to them if they did. One look in the wrong direction, and they would be the next victim. In this history documentary, we look at 5 terrifying torturers of the Second World War, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Martin Sommer was born on the 8th of February 1915, and he was a Master Sergeant in the SS. He rose to the rank of SS Hauptscharführer, and was known for serving as a guard at Dachau and also Buchenwald. As mentioned, he was considered a shocking SS guard, and his conduct mostly circled around what he did specifically at Buchenwald. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, ordered an SS judge, named George Conrad Morgan, to look at possible charges of corruption and cruelty that occurred at Buchenwald. As mentioned, the commandant and his wife were arrested and were brought to trial, but more stories emerged, also of Martin Sommer's conduct. The judge found evidence that alleged that Sommer had a secret compartment under the floor of his office, in which he kept many instruments of torture. It was believed that inside of his chamber, he had a number of needles which he used to kill the victims of his torture by injecting them with carbolic acid after he had done with them. He also possibly may have injected air into their veins, which caused prisoners and victims to have an embolism. It was alleged that late into the night Martin Sommer would torture the inmates of Buchenwald, and that after he killed them, he would hide the bodies of his victims under his bed, and then in the morning he would dispose of them in the crematoria, or they would be simply dumped elsewhere. He was linked to being a man who often whipped prisoners, sometimes to death. Floggings and whippings were known to be administered inside many different concentration camps to deal with people who were considered rule breakers. It was said at the whipping block, Sommer forced prisoners to count aloud the strikes of the whip he gave them, or when he beat them with a heavy stick. If a prisoner lost count, then Sommer would begin the punishment all over again. It was known that if 25 lashes or hits were given, a prisoner could survive this, but any more could easily result in death. One man was sentenced to 25 strikes, and Sommer then gave 60 lashes to him. This man, it was said, was killed on the spot, and Sommer later admitted to the beatings, and he even at trial built a cardboard model showing what the whipping block looked like. He said that I can't claim to have hit the last strikes as hard as the first, you always get a little tired. But it seemed his antics at the whipping post were just some of the less shocking crimes he committed. There were allegations that Sommer was seen inside of Buchenwald beating a pastor from Weimar to a bloody pulp. He then hanged him outside, and then threw buckets of cold water on him, and then left him to freeze to death in the cold. But the testimony about the hangman of Buchenwald would get much worse when he was met with evidence that he killed 2 Austrian priests in a completely barbaric attack inside of a forest near to the camp. The forest nearby became known as a singing forest, as it was here where Sommer would hang many people by their wrists to the trees, and they would scream long into the night and would suffer. In the winter these people would freeze to death and die from exposure. Otto Neururer and Matthias Spanglang were priests who had been sent to Buchenwald for actions that were deemed in opposition to the Nazis' ideas and beliefs. Neururer, for example, was sent to a concentration camp as he advised a woman not to marry a Nazi man who had questionable morals, and for this he was sent to Dachau before he was transferred to Buchenwald. At Buchenwald he was brutally tortured by Sommer, and he was sadistically killed inside of the camp. He was tortured for information following allegedly performing a banned baptism, and was subject to being hanged upside down, naked by Martin Sommer. The hangman, whilst he was hanged upside down, beat him, and for 34 hours Neururer was forced to undergo this, until he then succumbed to his ordeal, and died from his torture at the hands of the hangman. Also Matthias Spanglang underwent the same torture and was killed in the same way, and the 2 Austrian priests were killed by Sommer's thirst for violence and torture. The pair were crucified upside down, and one witness saw the events and said that Neururer did not complain once as he faced his death. Sommer was also accused of beating a Catholic priest to death, who performed the sacrament of penance on an inmate. Inside the nearby forest he carried out more hangings. He would be seen often leading a group of prisoners out to the nearby woods, and once in there he would tie their hands behind their backs and would hang them one by one from the trees there. They were tied with their hands behind their backs, and their full weight on their shoulders could easily cause dislocations, and this would be excruciating for the prisoners. Their feet were suspended around 18 inches from the ground, and the prisoners were often left there for hours, and the cries would echo across the camp. His crimes were compared to looking into Dante's Inferno, and there were accusations that his desk was lit from a candle inside of a skull of one of his victims. He is mentioned also administered lethal injections and would beat confessions out of a prisoner to a savage extent. He also, one time, placed the head of a prisoner inside an iron clamp and screwed it until the prisoner's skull cracked under the pressure. Now, as mentioned, Heinrich Himmler had assigned an SS judge to look into brutality and barbarism at Buchenwald, as well as improper treatment of prisoners. Himmler's man learned all about Sommer's treatment, and he was considered too much of a sadist and a brute for even the most harrowing of SS soldiers. For this he was reduced in his rank, and was then forced to serve inside a penal battalion on the Eastern Front, and he was later wounded in a tank explosion where he lost his right leg and left arm. He was taken as a prisoner of war by the Red Army, and was then considered a war criminal in 1950, before he was then released by the Soviets in 1955. He then went back to West Germany and married and had a child, and was considered a disabled war veteran, receiving a pension. However, he was later brought to trial for the deaths of 101 concentration camp prisoners, and in 1958 he was convicted of being responsible for the deaths of 25 of them, and for this was given a life sentence in prison. For the rest of his life, Sommer spent his time behind bars or inside hospitals or nursing homes. Martin Sommer, the hangman of Buchenwald, was a concentration camp guard whose crimes even appalled Heinrich Himmler, the man who was ultimately responsible for the Holocaust. His activities inside of Buchenwald were deemed as bringing the SS into disrepute and were considered too brutal for even the SS. He was a depraved and sick killer who was known for hanging his victims in the forests nearby, and also for crucifying priests, as well as killing his torture victims with his own hands. Sommer was a brute, and a man considered today one of the worst and most evil war criminals of the Second World War, and today many of Martin Sommer's crimes remain untold. Henry Oliver Rinnan was born on the 14th of May 1915 inside of Levanger in Norway, and he was born into a rather poor family. He was the eldest of 8 children, but he did not have the greatest childhood. Rinnan had very few friends, and he spent a lot of his time on his own, but he was known to others later in life because of his size. For a Norwegian man, he was remarkably short, standing at 5 feet 3 inches tall, but following working with his uncle in his business, Rinnan lost his job because he was caught stealing. He was a man who was more than comfortable with stealing from his own family members, and he would have very little remorse for his actions throughout his life. He was a vain but charming man, but following losing his job, he and his wife Clara were then living in a poorhouse. They were not allowed to keep any of their furniture except their bed. He was then employed as a car salesman in Trondheim, and his wife Clara then had their first child. However, Henry Rinnan around this time went on a short trip with another woman and returned home after 2 weeks, and he was also sacked from his job. However, in 1939, he tried to enlist in the Winter War in Finland. However, Rinnan had dentures in his upper mouth, and he was rejected because of this. But following the German invasion that occurred on the 9th of April 1940, he worked as a driver for Norwegian soldiers in Snarsa, but following the German occupation, he then served his enemies. In particular, he enlisted to become a German agent, and was recruited to become a member of the Gestapo in June 1940. His parents had been members of pro-German groups, but it is not known if Henry Rinnan also joined these. However, inside of the Gestapo, he was tasked with infiltrating left-wing resistance groups in Trondheim, and was working under the codename Fiskvik. Because of his work, around 50 to 60 people found themselves arrested for being communists. But in January 1942, he then recruited another 3 agents to work with him, and because of his work, he was given the rank of an SS Untersturmführer, and his group of spies then became known as the Rinnan Banden. They continued to infiltrate resistance groups, and they also tortured hundreds of people, and it's believed that over 80 people were killed by Rinnan and his men,
and it's claimed that he kept strict discipline and also acted as a judge and executioner in many cases for resistors himself. He has also been described by some as a cynical rat and a scoundrel, and one former worker with him claimed that he did not realise what a monster we had created. He claimed Rinnan had a kind of sixth sense. It was almost as if he could smell danger. The special thing about Rinnan was that he was able to carry out his evil in a system that was created for it. His agents would track people down and then engage them in conversations about their attitudes towards the occupation, and then his agents built trust to infiltrate their networks. But it's claimed that the spies were responsible for at least 100 deaths in the Norwegian resistance and for more than 1,000 arrests. There were plans drawn up to assassinate Rinnan, and British Special Operations Executive had learned about his actions. One man, Sven B. Svensson, had been tasked to kill Rinnan, but he had a lack of weapons to do this at the time. Further plans were drawn up to take him out, and there were a number of attempts to kill him. One, on the 7th of October 1943, did not go as planned, and he managed to escape unharmed, but another member of his torture group was shot and injured. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Henry Rinnan tried to make an escape with hostages and some other spies. However, he was taken close to the Swedish border. They hiked towards Sweden in the rough terrain and the snow, and Rinnan did have a new fiancée who was pregnant and struggled. His men wore German soldier uniforms to try and blend in, and on his possession, Rinnan had a huge amount of banknotes and also a gun. His hostages were to be shot, and one managed to escape during a blizzard. However, on the 15th of May 1945, he was found by Norwegian police and was arrested. But he did manage to escape from prison on the 24th of December 1945, and he was going to try and get to the Soviet Union to then work as a Soviet secret agent, but within a few hours he was caught again. He was a man who was hated inside of Norway. When he was brought into the centre of the city, a number of people had gathered, and he refused to get out of the car, and as he was dragged out, many people cheered his arrest. But Rinnan, whilst he was in prison, was beaten badly by the guards, and also by other inmates, and when he was interrogated for the first time, he had very bad bruises on his face, and his eyes were heavily swollen. To get him to confess to information, he was also subjected to mock executions, where he believed he would either be shot or executed. He was heavily investigated for treason, and dozens of deaths were attributed to Henry Rinnan and his group, and they were also linked to sending around 1,000 Norwegians to concentration camps, where many died as soon as they got there. It was said that Rinnan cooperated closely with the Gestapo, and he allowed a number of war criminals to gain their freedom. But in what was known as the Norwegian Treason Settlement, Henry Rinnan, along with 11 others from the Rinnan gang, were sentenced to death. 10 of these would be executed. Specifically, Henry Rinnan was convicted of 13 murders and many more crimes. He was held inside of a prison for a number of years until his execution was finally carried out on the 1st of February 1947. He was to be executed very early in the morning at 4:05 a.m. inside of Christiansand Fortress in Trondheim. During his final days, a priest had been with him to provide him with spiritual guidance as his execution date approached. He was led out to the execution firing range, and a doctor attached a white cardboard disc to Rinnan's chest, and the prison priest repeated the words of Jesus to the robber on the cross to him, saying, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me to paradise." The execution squad was led by Lieutenant Sawley, who oversaw the execution. He gave his orders for the firing squad to ready, and they raised their rifles. Rinnan stood emotionless and still, and he had been blindfolded also by a guard when he was tied and secured to the execution post. The order was then given to fire, and immediately the firing squad shot their weapons into him. However, this was not the end of the execution. The leader of the execution squad then approached Rinnan's body, and he pulled out his Mauser pistol, then fired 2 coup de grace gunshots into Rinnan's head at close range into his temple, ensuring that his death had occurred. Straight after the execution, his body was cremated, but there was a slight issue, as his body should not allegedly have been placed in a coffin when he was cremated. His ashes were then buried in an unmarked plot near to his hometown. It was claimed that Henry Rinnan was the most useful non-German that Heinrich Himmler had under his wing inside of Northern Europe, and he claimed he had handed over 5,000 people to the Gestapo to be dealt with. There was some debate following his execution as to what actually happened with it, as some claimed he was actually spotted boarding a plane hours after the execution allegedly took place. But the documentation for the execution clearly shows what happened to the Gestapo spy and informant, and he was ruthlessly shot by a firing squad. Then the leader of the executioners finished him off. Henry Rinnan was a man who was a torturer, a brute, and a barbaric spy and executioner himself, who horrifically betrayed Norway, his nation, in favour of the Nazis.
Wilhelm Boger was born on the 19th of December 1906 near to Stuttgart. He was the son of a merchant, but as a young man he joined the Hitler Youth, and this was a youth group for teenage boys, where they would be trained in how to become soldiers. Hitler hoped that one day he would have a force from the Hitler Youth who would lay their lives down for his empire, and he would get this at the end of the Second World War, as many young boys were fighting on the streets of Berlin in the final days of the conflict. But Wilhelm Boger, after he finished high school, worked with his father as a merchant, and he did this for a number of years before he then worked inside of an office. It was not the start in life you would expect for one of the Second World War's worst war criminals and sadistic torturers. But like the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, Boger was drawn to the Ottoman League, a group which promoted Germans getting back to the land and stood against industrialism. Boger then in 1929 joined the Nazi Party, as the policies of Hitler and what his government were promising appealed to him, and he then joined the SS in 1930, a year later. The SS would later become run by Heinrich Himmler, and at this time it was not the most powerful, and by 1930 they had just over around 1,000 men. But Himmler, when he seized control of the SS, would instigate stricter rules for those men who joined up, and he would turn the paramilitary group into the most powerful organisation in Germany, one of the most feared branches of the Nazi Party. It was at the time subordinate to the SA, Hitler's brown shirts, but they would later usurp the SA in their power. Wilhelm Boger, following losing his job in 1932, then became a member of the auxiliary police force, and then the political police, before he then attended further training. But he was a man who during his police career was known for mistreating those who he had arrested. He was made a police commissioner. However, in 1936 he was actually arrested himself with regards to an incident in which he had mistreated and brutalised a prisoner who he was meant to be interrogating. It would be this sort of behaviour which Boger applied to his later work inside of the concentration camps, and it was clear he was a man who was very violent. But as the Second World War broke out, Boger was working inside of the state police head offices, and he was later involved in setting up Nazi police stations in Poland following the invasion. The Nazis would round up people in occupied areas. They would then be sent to these stations to be tortured and interrogated by men such as Boger. But then he was called to the front lines, and he served as part of the 2nd SS and Police Engineer Reserve Unit, and in 1942 he was wounded in battle. Like many SS men who were wounded on the front lines, they were never returned to fighting and the conflict, but instead were sent to work inside of concentration camps. Wilhelm Boger was sent to Auschwitz, and it was inside of the deadly concentration camp where Boger would make his name for torture. Whilst at the site he was in charge of keeping records and also admitting prisoners, but he would also oversee the camp's security and conduct barbaric interrogations. Inside of Auschwitz, for the camp to function with efficiency and to keep the prisoners incredibly submissive to their guards, the Nazis used many terror tactics to do this. They executed prisoners in public in front of thousands of other inmates to strike fear into their hearts, and many of these condemned had only slightly infringed on the rules, such as stealing food to just survive. There was a block known for torture inside of Auschwitz, and this was Block 11. Inside here, guards such as Boger worked, and Block 11 was known for its torture, as there were standing cells inside of this block, where prisoners were locked into small tiny dungeons for days on end. Also here, the windows had been bricked up or covered, meaning no one could see the horror which was going on, and prisoners slept on the bare floor. They were locked in dark cells for a long time. Interrogations were usually brutal and barbaric, and medieval-style torture such as the manacles would be used, and Wilhelm Boger became known for his use of torture on the inmates. He gained the nickname for this, the Tiger of Auschwitz.
From the 23rd of December 1943, he was a leader of the section of investigations and interrogations, meaning it was Boger himself who would beat and interrogate with horror. He was a man who would use violence onto the inmates to force them to admit to crimes that many had no idea what had happened. But Wilhelm Boger left his mark on Auschwitz, and in particular he invented a torture method known as a Boger swing, named after him. His former secretary would report on this that it was a metre-long iron bar suspended by chains hung from the ceiling. The prisoner would be brought in for questioning, stripped naked and bent over the bar, wrists manacled to ankles. A guard on one side would shove him or her across the chamber in a long, slow arc, while Boger would ask the questions, at first quietly, then barking them out, and at last bellowing. At each return, another guard, armed with a crowbar, would smash the victim across the buttocks. As the swinging went on, and the wailing victim fainted, was revived, only to faint howling again, the blows continued, until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of that concrete floor to be dragged away. It was complete horror and brutality, and many died from their torture at the hands of the Tiger of Auschwitz. He remained at Auschwitz until the camp was liberated, but it's not known what he did until the day he was captured by American police on the 19th of June 1945. He may have gone to live with his parents, however Wilhelm Boger managed to escape his imprisonment in November 1946, and he slipped under the radar and worked as a farm worker. If he had not ran off, then it's most probable that he would have been executed for his crimes, alongside other guards of Auschwitz such as Rudolf Höss, Josef Kramer, Irma Grazer and others. But Boger continued to live a normal life at the end of the war, and he even lived with family under his real name and worked inside of an aircraft factory. But in October 1958, he was arrested at the age of 51. He had lived a quiet life, but when his neighbours and friends asked of his work during the war and at Auschwitz, he would lie. However, Boger passed the denazification programs, and it was said with this that he does not leave the impression of a raw, brutal man, but one of a more rational, well-schooled police commissioner and civil servant. But the investigation into him came to a brief end, as the costs were said to have been too much for the government. But then in 1959, Wilhelm Boger's time would be up, and he was arrested for a final time, and he was then charged with war crimes he had committed inside of Auschwitz. He was part of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, and a number of eyewitnesses came forward, and they spoke about his crimes and the torture he had inflicted, and because of this Wilhelm Boger was sentenced to life imprisonment and also hard labour for the murder of at least 114 people, and he was said to have been an accessory to murder in around 1,000 cases. He claimed in the courtroom that, during the National Socialist regime, the only point of view for me was to carry out the orders given by my superiors without restriction. I was sent to Auschwitz through no fault of my own. I don't want to refer to it. Today I see that the idea I clung to was ruinous and wrong. I don't want to sugarcoat anything. I want to leave no doubt that the tightened interrogations as ordered were carried out by me. At the time, however, the focus of my reflections was not on Auschwitz as a cruel place of extermination of European Jewry, but solely on combating the Polish resistance movement and Bolshevism. Wilhelm Boger admitted that Nazism had been a huge part of his life and that this was wrong, and he spoke down against his own actions. But he would remain in prison for the rest of his life, as the Tiger of Auschwitz died inside of a prison in Bietigheim, Bissingen, on the 3rd of April 1977, and he had spent the last 18 years of his life without any freedom. He was a man who, inside the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War, inflicted a huge amount of pain and suffering onto the inmates, and if he had not escaped his capture earlier, then he would have certainly been executed.
Wilhelm Dorr was born on the 9th of February 1921 in Hesse, a small town, and was raised on a farm where he worked as a labourer. As the Nazis rose to power, they imposed a number of youth groups onto Germany for the young people inside of the country to join. For boys, they joined the Hitler Youth, an organisation which sought to train boys to become soldiers one day, and it was this what Dorr joined, like millions across the country. Inside of the Hitler Youth he thrived, but on the 15th of December 1940, shortly after the Second World War broke out, he applied to volunteer for the army, however instead was directed to become part of the Waffen-SS. The Wehrmacht rejected his service, and at the time in the conflict, they were riding high on huge territorial gains of countries such as France, Poland, and they then turned their attention later east to the Soviet Union and the Balkans. Dorr then began training to become a combat engineer, someone tasked with fixing down broken military vehicles. However, in October 1941, he became rather ill, suffering with rheumatism. Because of this, he was then forced into hospital, where he spent a few months, but when he recovered, he was then reassigned to a brutal group. He became part of the SS Tossenkopfverbände, or the SSTV. This was part of the SS known for the control and administration of the concentration camps, and they oversaw and perpetrated much of the Holocaust. Inside of Germany they oversaw camps such as Bergen-Belsen, and outside in Nazi-occupied territory, they oversaw Auschwitz and many other camps. They were the group who were truly responsible in facilitating the Holocaust, organising huge deportations of Jews from countries straight to the death camps. The SSTV were also responsible for extermination camps and setting these up. These were camps with no other purpose but to murder innocent people within, and these were set up at sites such as Treblinka. When Wilhelm Dorr joined this, he was involved in the administration of the camps, and went on to travel to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, serving as a guard until December 1943. In January 1944, Wilhelm Dorr was transferred across to Mittelbau-Dora, where he worked as a block leader inside the main camp. He claimed this was the first time he had anything to do with any prisoners, and he claimed actually that when he was there at Dora, the prisoners were not overworked and underfed. He was appointed to become the deputy to Franz Stoffel, the commander who was in charge of the smaller Kleinbedungen camp, in September 1944. It was clear that Dorr sought promotion inside of a concentration camp system, and he was rewarded for his service. Whilst here he was allegedly involved in an incident involving prisoners who were hiding in the potato cellars. Dorr ordered 3 other prisoners to beat the 2 until they were dead, and despite denying this, it was proven that this did occur. He helped to manage around 620 prisoners who were involved in creating V2 ballistic missiles, and they forced these people to work very hard. However, Dorr was later convicted for his crimes and was sentenced to death for what occurred after he left Kleinbedungen. As the Allies advanced towards the camp, Dorr and Stoffel were ordered to evacuate the prisoners and to head further back towards German lines. With this, they force-marched 620 on a death march in horrific conditions. The prisoners were given very little food and rest, and were forced to walk 30 kilometres a day, many of them in bare feet, as they had no shoes, and many others had to walk in the wooden clogs given to them to prevent escape in the camp. The march was originally intended to reach a different area, but when it arrived one night at Großhalen, shooting took place. It was at the time a defensive position for the Waffen-SS, and Stoffel was told that his prisoners could not stay here, despite the fact they had marched 36 kilometres that day. Dorr and Stoffel went away, then the Waffen-SS started firing shots in the air which caused a panic, and when they returned, there were around 8 bodies of prisoners lying at the side of the road. The condition of Dorr and Stoffel's death march was treacherous, and eventually they headed towards Bergen-Belsen, and it was claimed they had no idea where they were going. Prisoners who attempted to escape were shot in the back of the head when captured, as were those who were slowing down the march. When they arrived at Bergen-Belsen, around 30 prisoners had been killed, either by the SS guards or by the sheer exhaustion. Dorr and Stoffel's group arrived at Bergen-Belsen on the 11th of April 1945, and when they arrived they were met with a camp on its knees. Bergen-Belsen had for a number of months been greatly suffering with overcrowding as prisoners were sent there from the front lines, back towards Germany, and there was a horrific shortage of food inside the camp. This, along with huge outbreaks of disease such as typhoid fever, typhus and TB, caused a horrendous scene, with thousands of dead bodies lining the camp's walls, with around 60,000 prisoners just starving and suffering. The British forces liberated the camp 4 days after the death march arrived, after an agreement was made with Heinrich Himmler to hand over the camp without any bloodshed. Following this, the British then put the SS personnel to work to bury the dead, and Wilhelm Dorr was forced to complete this work. He was then arrested for his crimes by the British military, and was brought to face justice, along with 45 other war criminals, including the commandant of Belsen, Josef Kramer, and infamous guard Irma Grazer at the Belsen trials. Wilhelm Dorr was accused of crimes against humanity at Bergen-Belsen, and he pleaded not guilty. During his testimony and questioning, he was asked about the executions and murders that took place on the Death March, along with the other camps he worked at. He maintained his innocence throughout, stating how he ensured prisoners were fed and looked after well, but this was clearly a lie, and it was seen through by the judges. Other witnesses testified that during the Death March, there were prisoners who were executed in cold blood, and ultimately, along with Franz Stoffel, Wilhelm Dorr was responsible for this, as he was almost acting as the deputy leader of the march. He said prisoners received 500 grams of bread in the morning, cheese or sausages and margarine, and then sometimes bits of meat, before getting a hot meal in the evening, but this wasn't the case. It was also alleged that Dorr himself had shot 13 or 14 prisoners because they had bad feet or had diseases that meant they could not carry on. It was claimed also that they covered 51 kilometres on the first day, and on the first day he shot one man, before later shooting another couple in some woods. He could not clearly account for around the 30 prisoners that they had lost. Following his testimony, Wilhelm Dorr, despite only being 24, was sentenced to death for his crimes. It was clear that he treated the prisoners on the Death March horrifically, and the judges deemed it to be true that he murdered a number of prisoners in cold blood. After being condemned to death, he was held in Hamelin prison to await his execution, which came on the 13th of December 1945. Along with the other condemned to death following the Belsen trials, he was held in a row of cells, and at the end of the row was an execution chamber that was being set up by the British military. Inside the chamber, a gallows had been created with a simultaneous drop for British executioner Albert Pierpoint to conduct his work. Pierpoint and his assistant met with all the condemned, including Dorr, to work out their height and weight, and then the drop needed to snap their necks and kill them instantly. On the 13th of December 1945, the women who were condemned were executed first by Pierpoint, using the simultaneous drop, before the men took their place on the gallows. Wilhelm Dorr was taken from his cell to the execution chamber by 2 guards who then escorted him up the stairs as his arms and legs were tied. Pierpoint then placed a black hood over his head, along with the noose, before he shuffled Dorr over a chalk X he had drawn on the floor above the trapdoor. Almost as instantly as he was placed on the X, Pierpoint pulled the lever and Dorr was executed. He was just 24 when he faced the executioner. Wilhelm Dorr was not the only young person who seemed to thrive inside the barbaric concentration camp system. Many of the SS guards were younger and had been brainwashed by the political and ideology of the Nazis from a young age, and Dorr was one of these. He was a brutal man who seemed to relish the power he possessed over those, and during the Death March he demonstrated the worst evils of humanity, murdering in cold blood.
Adolf Speck was born in 1911, and he, like millions of people inside of Germany, was attracted to the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis, following the failings of the Weimar Republic, promised to provide people with food and work, and Adolf Hitler quickly gained a huge following, and he managed to manipulate his way into power. Many of the most virulent Nazis would later take jobs inside of concentration camps, and they devoted their time to the Nazi cause, keeping political prisoners and those who were being persecuted locked up inside of sites such as Dachau, which was the first Nazi concentration camp which opened. Adolf Speck worked in Kiel, and he then later trained with a police battalion to become a police officer. However, as the Second World War broke out, he was deployed to the Eastern Front following the launching of Operation Barbarossa. It's not known specifically what he did inside of the armed forces, whether he was on the front lines or whether he was involved in rounding up civilians for execution in his police role, or he may have just been a police officer who worked under occupation inside the foreign lands. He would also later be sent to the Netherlands. But in 1943, Speck was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp, where he worked as a guard. He arrived in the summer of that year, and then worked as the commander of the brickworks, overseeing a number of prisoners who were working in the facility. He was known for being a violent brute who would whip and beat inmates who he believed were not working hard enough. Neuengamme as a concentration camp was huge, and over 100,000 political prisoners passed through the main camp and its subcamps. It's believed around 43,000 people were slaughtered inside of the camp, and many at the end of the war died in the death marches. The camp deployed an extreme extermination through labour policy, and hunger at the site killed most of the inmates. The prisoners' food was so poor and insufficient that, coupled with the brutal work they were forced to do, the life expectancy of inmates was roughly just 3 months from when they first entered the camp. Prisoners also contracted dysentery, and this killed many, and some tried their best to obtain whatever scraps of food and hydration that they could get. Life at the site was a constant battle to survive, and prisoners slept on the floor of overcrowded wooden barracks. Sleep was also impossible in these rooms, and the prisoners were forced to work 10 to 12-hour days. The working conditions and the violence of guards such as Adolf Speck led to thousands of deaths, and the SS guards also utilised brutal punishments. Many prisoners at Neuengamme were killed by lethal injection if they could not work hard enough, and a crematoria in April 1942 was constructed at the camp, as previously all of the bodies of the deceased were sent to Hamburg for cremation, which the Nazis later deemed as being too costly. As mentioned, Adolf Speck was good friends with the Neuengamme camp commandant Max Pauli, and through this relationship he received SS promotion and promotion inside of the camp. But one horrific crime that Speck was involved in was committed inside of the Bullenhauser Damm school in Hamburg. It was here where 20 children and their carers were executed and killed in terrible ways. Neuengamme opened up a subcamp in the school to house prisoners, and this was later evacuated. But on the night of April the 20th, 1945, 20 Jewish children who had been used in sadistic human medical experimentation at Neuengamme were injected with morphine, and they were then hanged from the walls of the basement of the school. Their carers, shall we say, were also subjected to this treatment, 4 adults and 6 Soviet prisoners who were all executed in this manner as well. Later, 24 other Soviet prisoners were brought to the school, and they were murdered. This incident became known as the Bullenhauser Damm massacre. Adolf Speck was one of 3 SS guards, as well as a driver, who accompanied SS doctors to carry out the killings. It was later stated of the crime that the children sat down on the benches all around and were cheerful and happy that they had for once been allowed out of Neuengamme. The children were completely unsuspecting. After being injected, the victims were hanged from hooks, and some of the guards even used their own weight to tighten the noose around the necks, pulling down on the bodies. It was later stated at his trial about his conduct inside of Neuengamme that, and I quote, "Speck has brought the curse of all the prisoners upon himself. When a hungry inmate sneaks through the camp and steals a turnip somewhere to fill himself up, Speck reaches for it. The inmate has to bend down and is hit until he collapses. Then he gets kicked on top of that. Speck is not always sure whether he is allowed to act like that, but he feels like an absolute lord, a master, and thus remains nothing more than a beast in human form, despised and silently lurking around all the prisoners. But unfortunately, we are defenceless against this devil from hell. He has deaths on his conscience, and yet has no conscience. We prisoners remember our tormentors well. At the rear exit of the camp, Speck is in his territory. Here he controls every inmate like a lynx. Nothing escapes him. At his guard booth, he beats up the prisoners. The camp leader or commander never knew anything about his actions. Speck does not report punishment. He punishes himself. And the punishment is usually more severe. In the evenings when he is on duty, he runs around the block like a madman, looking for victims. He has to hit people. It is in his blood. He is not satisfied if a day goes by without being hit. The most cowardly thing about him is that he does not choose big, strong people, but always the Muselmaner, the weak ones. He is certainly afraid of the strong ones, who are already few and far between. Another former prisoner of the camp claimed about his crimes that Thurman's second assistant, Speck, was the chief executioner in the camp. Very few prisoners escaped his torture. The professional sadistic executioner delighted in the suffering of his victims. If someone he was tormenting did not scream or beg for mercy, Speck could beat him to death. Even if he had no guilty person in front of him, which rarely happened, the perverse sadist subjected the first person he saw to torture, whether because he had not been respectful enough or because he had not pulled his cap off quickly enough when he passed Speck. At the end of the Second World War, Adolf Speck accompanied a transport of roughly 250 prisoners to Flensburg, and he claimed he was just a policeman, and he then handed himself over to the authorities. In the Curio House trial, the courtroom heard about his crimes, and for this he was sentenced to death. It was inside of Hamelin Prison's execution chamber that Adolf Speck's life was brought to an end. Experienced British executioner Albert Pierpoint was a man who took his life. On the day of his execution, the 6th of October 1946, Speck was transferred to the condemned cell in the prison's west wing, and these cells held the condemned for a matter of hours. Previously, Pierpoint had met with Speck and the others and calculated their height and weight, and then the drop needed to bring their lives to a quick end. Pierpoint executed the men in pairs, so Adolf Speck, along with another condemned man, would have been brought out of the small condemned cells, had their arms secured behind their backs, and he was then led into the execution chamber. The gallows here had enough space to hang two at once, and Speck was then taken up the steps and led onto a small chalk mark on the floor. A black or white hood was then placed over his head, and the noose was secured by Pierpoint. After the two men were stood in position, with the nooses secured, Pierpoint released the trapdoor, and Speck plunged to his death through the gallows. Adolf Speck was a brutal and ruthless man who tortured and beat prisoners inside of Neuengamme on a daily basis. He was someone who was known for his evil. But he was, at the end of the Second World War, condemned for his role inside of the concentration camps, but also for his involvement in the terrible crimes that took place inside of the school. He is remembered alongside other concentration camp guards for his crimes, and he was one of many who were hanged by Albert Pierpoint inside of Hamelin Prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.